A board-certified forensic pathologist watched the same press conference the rest of the country did. Then she said something the sheriff's office did not. She said the manner of death being called wasn't just premature. It might not even be possible yet. Not with the body this case has. Not with the parts of it that are missing. Her name is Dr. Judy Melinek. She has no connection to the Wells family. No connection to the state of Mississippi. No stake in this case at all. Which is exactly why what she's about to say matters. Because when a stranger with no dog in the fight looks at the same evidence everyone else saw and comes away with more questions than answers, that's not speculation. That's a professional telling you the science doesn't support the certainty you were handed. We're about to show you her full breakdown, but before we do, you need 3 pieces of context the press conference didn't give you. About drowning, about decomposition, and about a part of Nolan Wells' body that never made it back to his family. Welcome back to Black Docket. If you're new here, hit subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. We track this case as the documents come in, not as the headlines get written. Let's get into it. Here's something most people don't know about how a medical examiner is actually supposed to work. Drowning is what forensic pathologists call a diagnosis of exclusion. That means you're not allowed to write it down first. You have to rule out everything else that could explain a body found in water. Strangulation, blunt trauma, a gunshot, a heart attack, before drowning becomes the answer written on a death certificate. Nolan Wells' body was recovered 2 days after he went missing. A second independent autopsy wasn't performed until 4 days after that. In forensic terms, that gap is not small. Decomposition doesn't pause for an investigation to catch up. This is the exact problem Dr. Melinek raises in the clip you're about to hear.
I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they're exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released, with a fine-tooth comb, but this is just my first impressions based on watching the press report.
Why do we accept a conclusion the moment it's spoken, long before anyone has actually verified it? Why does the human mind stop asking questions the second an official stands at a podium and speaks with absolute certainty? And what happens when the one piece of evidence capable of resolving everything is the very piece locked behind closed doors? That question sits at the heart of the latest turn in the Nolan Wells case. It's why investigators, journalists, and now a forensic doctor are viewing this death through a radically different lens than they were just months ago. A medical expert reviewing the available case materials has raised the possibility of manual strangulation. That single finding has reopened a debate many assumed was already closed. But what compelled a trained forensic mind to challenge the official narrative? What did this doctor actually see? And, more importantly, what was kept out of sight? These aren't hypothetical questions. They dismantle the very foundation the public was told to accept. Today, we are walking through the medical records, the forensic science, and the critical details that rarely make it into a headline. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why this doctor's assessment has become the most contentious point in the investigation, and why the answer likely sits in a room no independent expert has been allowed to enter. If you value case coverage that follows the evidence instead of the sensationalism, take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. In a case where documents drop gradually, The outlets that report first are rarely the ones that get it right. We prioritize accuracy over speed, and that only matters if you're here when the evidence surfaces. To understand where this investigation broke down, we have to look at how the process is actually supposed to work. A cause of death isn't a guess made at a scene. It is a conclusion reached only after every competing possibility has been methodically tested and eliminated. In this case, that process was inverted before a formal examination ever took place. Within days of Nolan's disappearance, the Jackson County Sheriff stood before cameras and assured the public there was no evidence of foul play. At that point, no autopsy had been conducted. No pathologist had evaluated the body. The investigation was barely underway, yet the public was handed a finished narrative. Here is a reality of forensic pathology that rarely gets explained. Drowning is a diagnosis of exclusion. An examiner cannot simply look at a body recovered from water and log drowning on a death certificate. Water conceals physical evidence. A person can drown, or a person can die of a violent crime and end up in the water afterward. Visually, those two outcomes can look nearly identical. Because of this, a pathologist must work backward. They must first rule out blunt force trauma, neck injury, fatal toxicity, and internal hemorrhaging. Only when every other cause has been definitively ruled out can drowning be assigned. That is the standard, and it is non-negotiable. The initial public statement bypassed this entire scientific protocol, offering a conclusion before the investigation had even begun. Now factor in the timeline. Nolan was a teenager who had been missing for several days before his body was recovered on July 6th. Every passing hour alters what a body can reveal. Decomposition doesn't pause for law enforcement. Water alters tissue. Time erodes subtle physical markers. The moment Nolan was found, time became the enemy of forensic accuracy, which makes a rapid, overconfident public declaration all the more alarming. It is possible the sheriff observed details at the scene that influenced his perspective, but a scene observation is not a peer-reviewed forensic finding, nor can it be evaluated by an outside expert. A statement made on camera carries massive public authority, whether backed by science or not. Once the word accident is introduced, that framing anchors the entire case. It dictates how aggressively leads are pursued, how the public interprets updates, and how much pressure is applied to look deeper. You examine first, you conclude second. In this instance, the sequence was reversed, and once a narrative is set, it is exceptionally difficult to unravel. Nolan's family did not accept this process. They didn't stage public outbursts. Instead, they retained independent counsel, bringing in attorney Benjamin Crump, and hired an independent pathologist. On July 10th, just days after recovery, a second autopsy was performed, allowing an independent examiner to evaluate the state's claims directly against the physical evidence. However, a second autopsy is never a clean slate. Time destroys physical data. The body had already spent days submerged, followed by the state's initial procedures, before the second examiner ever received it. Refrigeration slows decomposition, but it does not stop it, and water-softened tissue makes delicate structures harder to interpret. The second pathologist was essentially tasked with reading a document that had been damaged by the elements. The independent exam did not yield a finding of accident, nor did it yield homicide. It yielded something far more precise: undetermined. In forensic science, undetermined does not mean nothing happened, nor does it invalidate the family's concerns. It simply means the available evidence was insufficient to definitively lock in a single cause of death. Where the state offered a swift, unverified answer, the independent expert acknowledged the limits of what the physical evidence could prove. That isn't a conflict of opinions. It is a refusal to overstate what the science supports. Why couldn't the independent examiner reach a definitive verdict? He possessed the credentials, the family's authorization, and direct access to the body. What he lacked was complete physical evidence. An autopsy can only analyze what is physically on the table. In this case, a crucial structural component was absent, not lost to decay, but withheld. The state medical examiner's office had retained the anterior neck structures, commonly referred to as the neck block, and did not release them with the rest of the body. When the independent pathologist conducted his evaluation, that section was entirely missing. This detail is critical. Different causes of death leave evidence in distinct areas. In cases involving manual strangulation, the physical evidence is concentrated almost exclusively in the front of the neck. The back consists primarily of muscle and spine. The front houses the airway, vascular pathways, and delicate structures vulnerable to external force. When evaluating potential strangulation, a forensic pathologist looks for three key markers. The hyoid bone, a delicate, horseshoe-shaped bone high in the throat that, unlike most bones, is unanchored and prone to fracturing under targeted pressure. The strap muscles, deep layer muscles along the front of the neck where small blood vessels can rupture under compression, revealing internal trauma even when external bruising is minimal. Petechiae, pinpoint capillary hemorrhages caused by a sudden spike in vascular pressure, commonly found in the eyes, facial tissue, or internal organ linings. All three of these indicators reside within the exact tissue structure the state retained. This brings us back to the recent expert statement. A medical professional reviewing this case can only highlight the obvious limitation. Without access to the front of the neck, you cannot confirm strangulation, but you cannot rule it out either. That is the core issue. It isn't that the available evidence proves a crime occurred, it's that the specific evidence needed to answer the question was never made available to independent review. To be clear, retaining tissue during an investigation is a standard medical examiner protocol. It is done to preserve samples for further study or maintain evidence for legal proceedings. Tissue retention alone is not proof of misconduct. However, if the state retained that neck block, they examined it. Whatever findings resulted from that examination are recorded in the initial autopsy report, a document that remains unreleased to the public. The retention of the tissue isn't the primary issue. The silence surrounding the findings is. Compounding this uncertainty is the toxicology data, specifically the blood alcohol concentration, BAC. A numerical value on a lab report appears objective, but without proper forensic context, it can be deeply misleading. In a fresh specimen, BAC straightforwardly indicates recent consumption, but in a body that has undergone decomposition, post-mortem ethanol production occurs. Environmental bacteria synthesize alcohol naturally within the tissue, independent of anything ingested prior to death. In submerged or decomposing remains, internally produced alcohol can easily reach levels that mirror severe intoxication. Given the time Nolan's body spent in the water, any BAC measurement must be calculated with post-mortem microbial activity in mind. A rigorous forensic review accounts for these variables and checks secondary metabolic markers. Presenting a raw toxicology number without that context offers an incomplete and potentially false narrative. Beyond the laboratory data, the official posture surrounding this case has noticeably shifted. When pressed directly by journalists for clear answers rather than standard statements, local officials altered their language. The early certainty vanished, replaced by a vague assertion that the case remains under active investigation. This creates a clear contradiction. A case cannot simultaneously be a closed accidental death and an active open investigation. When pushed for details on this discrepancy, officials deflected responsibility across departments. This lack of clarity has naturally raised questions regarding process and oversight. In smaller jurisdictions, professional networks are closely knit. While local familiarity does not inherently imply bias, it highlights why external, fully independent oversight is essential when evaluating sensitive findings. Where does the Nolan Wells case stand right now? We are left with a toxicology figure that requires proper forensic context, an official narrative that has retreated under scrutiny, a family seeking transparent answers, and a public left evaluating a process kept behind closed doors. There are two distinct challenges here, one scientific, one procedural. Both lead back to the same unreleased document, the state's original autopsy report. There is a fundamental difference between an unsolved case and an unfinished. 1. An unsolved case implies the evidence no longer exists. This case is unfinished because the physical evidence and documentation exist. They simply haven't been made public. Moving this case forward requires 3 specific steps. 1. The original autopsy report, the release of the state's official findings detailing the condition of the remains and the documented justification for tissue retention. 2. Access to retained tissue, independent examination of the preserved neck structures to allow a definitive evaluation of potential trauma. 3. Contextual toxicology, a complete toxicological analysis that accounts for post-mortem changes rather than relying on unadjusted metrics. None of these steps require speculation, only access and transparency. To remain objective, no charges have been filed, no crime has been legally established, and the independent finding remains undetermined. What remains indisputable is that a public conclusion was declared before the scientific evaluation was complete, setting off the chain of events that brings us here today. The family is not asking for assumptions, they are asking for verifiable, documented facts. Release the primary report. Provide access to the retained tissue. Finalize the toxicology analysis with proper context. Whatever those findings reveal, whether confirming an accident or indicating something else, the family and the public deserve a conclusion grounded in complete science. We don't have the final chapter of this case yet, but the requirements to reach it are clear. As new documentation and reports are made available, we will analyze them step by step. Subscribe and turn on notifications to stay informed as this case continues to develop.